I've been involved in Israel since 1961. I had family in Israel, I had close friends in Israel, and I knew Rabin, the prime minister who was murdered by a Jewish extremist whose aim, successful, was to stop a peace process in Palestine. But he did something which the present Israeli government is too stupid, too illiterate, too blind to understand. When I had a meeting with him when he was Minister of Defense in the Knesset, in his office in the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament in Jerusalem. And I said to him, you realize that you're going to have to talk to Arafat. And he said, I will never talk to Arafat. And I said, if you don't talk to Arafat, the only people left over for you to talk to will be Hamas. And he swallowed every grudge and every bitterness that he had. Arafat, I knew Arafat for very many years, an extraordinarily skillful politician and a very clever man. But in the end, he wouldn't walk that extra mile. I first became truly aware of the plight of Palestinians when I wrote a book in 1982, and I travelled around the West Bank, and I looked at the way in which the Palestinians were living in poverty and unemployment compared with the affluence of the illegal Jewish settlements next to which they lived. The relationship of the illegal Jewish settlements living in affluence and well-armed physically to the Palestine townships living in poverty and unemployment is so close that anybody with the slightest perception of justice must be horrified about it, as I was, and have been, and continue to be. I led a parliamentary delegation, the first parliamentary delegation to the Palestinian territories a couple of years ago. And the sheer ignorance of the Israeli troops. I thought Jews were supposed to be clever. The sheer ignorance of the Israeli troops when they held our parliamentary delegation twice at gunpoint showed that these are not simply soldiers, they're thugs. And it was only because of the fact that we found an officer that we were no longer held at gunpoint. But in a sense, you can understand how defensive the Israelis may feel. Because, of course, they who went to Palestine to build the kibbutzim and the settlements from the oppression of Eastern Europe, they have now constructed a ghetto for themselves. They're living in a ghetto just as much as my parents lived in ghettos in Poland before they came to the freedom of England. The Israelis have built a wall, an illegal wall, and the result of that is that the Israelis cower behind the wall. They don't dare go beyond it unless they're the settlers protected with armaments of which the Palestinians are deprived. So the Israelis are as in much of a ghetto as they were and as their ancestors were when they fled in hope to Palestine. And you only have to be there, not see what's shown on television, but experience on the ground what a hell this is for the Israelis and what a hell this is for the Palestinians. 500 roadblocks so the Palestinians cannot move around. If they had jobs, they couldn't go to work. If they had university places, they couldn't go to the university. If they had school places for their children, they couldn't go to them. If they were sick and needed to go to hospital, they couldn't go there. When we passed entrances, bad roads into the Palestinian towns and villages, what did we see that the Israelis had done? They dug trenches and piled up the trenches with human physical waste as a way of deterring the Palestinians from moving. And my parliamentary delegation saw it, and my parliamentary delegation smelled it as well. So they have the roadblocks. They have the illegal wall. They have the illegal settlements, which are against international law. And of course, earlier this year, at the end of last year, beginning of this year, they launched this war against the people of Gaza. And I say, yes, quite certainly. Hamas, who control Gaza, are an intractable and ugly political force. But they won a democratic election. And my good friend, Abba Eban, who was the foreign minister of Israel for many years, said, how do you make peace except with talking to your enemies? And of course, Hamas are a deeply unpleasant organization. And of course, they have fired rockets over Israel. And there is a guided tour by the Israelis now. When they've got foreign visitors, they show them Sderot and one or two other places where the rockets have landed. And I'm sure the people there hate it. And if I lived there, I'd hate it too. But for every Israeli killed by Palestinian rockets, 100 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli troops, often, and the UN has revealed this, deliberately firing at women and children and killing them.
Rubbish.
Quite apart.
Rubbish.
When you can say it's rubbish when the sun rises in the morning and sets at night, but you're saying rubbish doesn't stop it from being true. That's eloquence from the people who disagree with me. Let me say this. The Palestinians have not only been killed in huge numbers, but they are living in terrible poverty and suffering. Barack Obama, a few weeks ago, went to Cairo and made a speech. And it needed saying that there had to be a two-state solution. And Netanyahu has said that he accepts a two-state solution. But what does he accept it with? He accepts it with a Palestine which will be disarmed. He accepts it with a Palestine which will have no control over its own airspace. He accepts it with a Palestine that will be forced before there is a word of negotiation to acknowledge Israel as a Jewish state, though despite the fact that 20% of the population are not Jews. But what has been the response of Netanyahu on settlements? Not only has he refused to freeze them, as Obama said, though in fact under international law they should all be dismantled, but he is expanding them. With great respect to President Obama, what we will judge is not the eloquence of his words, but what happens as a result of his words.